So I think we are ready to get started off. Like Mallory might be running a little bit late today. So she had her IAB meeting earlier, and then she's like on the way to this one. So thank you very much for heading here to this meeting. This is the regular note well. So it's Thursday. I'm sure you've all seen it like a few times, but it's like our duty to put it up. So just make sure that you take a quick look at it, and like all the contributions you make here are subject to 5378 and 8179. So just going over the agenda very quickly, there's like a few new items to talk about today. Like, Mark is going to present like, the scheduling of online meetings draft, and Daniel has like some carbon emission stuff like he's going to talk about. And Jay also had like a small update to give regarding like, how IETF is going to handle like, measuring carbon emissions and so on. So just a quick announcement from Jay at the end. And we also had some information about like Miria, like about the draft, like the online meetings draft as well. So the adoption call completed, but we haven't gotten any like yay or nay on the draft. So we'll probably like continue this like a little bit to try to at least solicit some reviews going forward. But I think like like it's been quite well discussed to see there's like support for adoption. So I think we'll just like continue to get a little bit more feedback on it. And Miria, like, have you gotten any private feedback on it, on the draft? Okay, cool, got it, thank you. So Miria like said no, so from here, thanks. Hey, Mallory. Hey. I just started off. So so on the recharter, like thanks Lars like for pushing this through. There was like the final block, like the like Mallory like crafted text to clear the final block from Ben Kadak. So the charter is in external review as like far as we can see. And so once it's done, Lars, like you'll get a draft coming through. So like the Miria and Martin's draft, like it's gonna like turn around and come back through to as like BCP after the chartering is complete.
Yeah, on the charter, and I don't know if this microphone actually is working.
Oh, it is. Like we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Then I'll speak up for the people in the room. So on the charter, I'm making Jay type some text right now, and then I'm gonna stick it in and do another charter revision, and then I will basically push it forward. And I think it is sort of approved with this point raised status, I think is it called now. So
Yeah.
it should then basically take effect soonish. I don't know.
Excellent.
Probably doesn't need to come back to the ISG. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Lars. And so the guidelines for canceling in-person meetings and replacing them with online meetings, like there's like SHMOO cancel meeting, it has been published as RFC 9137 since the last meeting cycle. So thank you everybody for like working on it and like providing like lots of comments, and Lars again like for like being very patient and pushing this through. And as I said, like the remote fee draft will, once the charter is complete, we can just push it back to the IESG because we're just waiting on it. Like I think the like working group process has completed on it, so it's just a change in the status, and that was as a result of comments we got in the working group process. So we'll just push it to the IESG as soon as possible. And there's like 3 drafts for the one of the original deliverables, which is the meeting planning for the replacement meeting. So the SHMOO hackathon draft is completed working group last call. All the comments have been addressed. There's like some Shepherd comments that Mallory put in. I think like Charles is going to address it like as soon as possible, along with the IETF last call comments or like AD review comments when you get them. So this morning I just pushed the button, Lars, like you should have the draft with you right now. So once we get the AD review comments, like, if there's any, like Charles will address Mallory's comments along with it. If not, like during IETF last call, he can address the comments as well. And the Kilowin SHMOO online meeting, the adoption call is completed. This is the one I talked about earlier. So there's like been like no comments received. So like we'll just like dig a little bit more to see if somebody can review the draft. But I think like I would say provisionally this is adopted going forward. And for like Mark's draft is going to get presented today. So that's also another draft in the same space. So like we'll hear Mark talk and see how we go forward with that. So this is the agenda for today. It's like fairly light, so we should be able to finish quite early. So we're not going to cut off the mic discussion on any of this stuff, like unless it goes like really, really long. And does anybody have any concerns with the agenda? Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much. And Mark, if you're online.
Am I here yet?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Hello. So I don't think I'm going to need very long to present. Maybe we can have time for discussion. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, Mark,
so this is
I gave you slide control, Mark, in case you want to move the things.
Oh, okay. Oh, cool.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
So this is a draft I wrote a little while ago, just based on experience that I've had participating in online meetings, I guess from a slightly unusual time zone in the IETF. Also, when we were on the IB, a lot of this came up. And also in previous lives working in bodies and places like the W3C. And so it's just kind of basically section 2 is considerations for when you schedule online meetings, things you want to consider. Section 3 is some recommendations on how to find an equitable solution, one that is relatively fair to all the participants. And I think there are a lot of discussions we could have about, the decisions made there and the recommendations. These are just kind of my standpoint. I'm not particularly set in stone, but if people feel differently, I'd love to talk about it. And I've written in such a way that although it's an IETF document, it's not IETF specific. I think that a lot of these are things that you could use in other fora as well if you wanted to, and that's intentional. And I guess my question today was, I brought this up on Gen Dispatch, and Lars recommended I bring it to SHMOO. I brought it up on the mailing list. I didn't get any responses, so I just wanted to see if folks were interested in talking about this in this working group. I'm not necessarily asking for adoption, just wondering if it's in scope for what this group is chartered to do. Although if you want to talk about adoption, I'm happy to talk about that too.
Martin, go ahead.
Hi, Mark. Martin Duke, Google.
Hey, Martin. How you doing? Google.
I inferred from the text that you were referring to sort of one-off meetings rather than big IETF meetings. Is that an accurate
Generally
assessment?
speaking, yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the if I go back here, effectively we've got method 1, method 2, method 3 under the 3.3, and the big IETF meeting falls under method 3, rotate the pane. We can't possibly come up with a time or a schedule that meets everyone's requirements, and indeed it's counterproductive to try and do that, because if you did something like say, well, most people are from North America, so we'll always hold them in North America. That's not good for other reasons. And so it walks you through those different things. And I'm sure the document can be improved. But generally speaking, one-off meetings, it talks about occasional meetings versus regular meetings and things like that as well.
Okay, cool. I mean, this is almost like a superset of the scheduling bit of Miriam's draft. We have a hyper-specific, precisely specified version of rotate the pane. So I don't know that these. So while there's some overlap, I don't think these two are in conflict.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of Miriam's draft, and I could see incorporating it or rationalizing them, but also I could see keeping it separate, so it is useful to a broader audience.
Lars, is it actually in scope? Is this in the charter or not? I can't remember.
So
I think with the newer charter, it might be in scope, right? Like Lars, right? Like, but yeah, overall, like previously, it was not really in scope of here at all, right? And like the way I saw it, like, and Lars, I'll go. Like, I just want to I had one thought on this is that like Mark's draft is like wider, and Martin, like yours and Miriam's, like goes really into like one section of it, right? Like in a lot of detail. So I agree with you. Like, there's not like that much overlap, like, and we had to figure out like how to dispatch with it. Like, so I'll let Lars speak next. Thanks.
Yeah, so it might be in scope, as you say, right? if the working group wants to work on this, since the charter is currently being revised, right, we might stick a change in there that makes it very clear that it is in scope. The other option is, I mean, this is certainly, even if we decide it's not in scope for the working group, this is certainly the forum in which to discuss this. And if there's consensus that it should be published, it could also be AD sponsored. I really don't care, frankly. Remind me, is it BCP level at the moment? What do you intend, Mark? Or is it informational or?
I don't know really. I'm sure there's something on the document, but I don't think I've really got that far with it. I
Yeah,
mean,
so I'm open for suggestions, right? I mean, if the working group wants to take this on, it seems like a very small change to make this more explicit in the current charter text, and we can certainly do that. In terms of the overlap between the two documents, right? One way to do this, if Marx really has more options and is a bit broader and maybe more general, you could take that part out of your document and refers to his and vice versa.
Well, I mean,
For
I think,
example-
I mean, we are addressing the specific issue of scheduling big IETFs remotely.
Okay.
And so this is like an instantiation of this that is super duper specific.
Okay, so the right approach then would probably to point to Mark's document to say this has some general considerations, and for the purposes of the IETF, right, we are instantiating them in the following way.
Yeah.
Right.
So, as people in the ISG know, I have massively overthought a lot of these issues. So I would certainly be interested in reviewing this. Whether it like is in this forum or another one, I don't really care. But you know, I don't know what others think. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Right, like Pete just walked in, like so. This was like a referral from Gender's Pat. So, like if Pete wants to join the line later, that'll be good as well if he has his thoughts on it. And Robert, you're next. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, could I respond to Martin there real quick?
Yeah, sure.
I don't think it necessarily needs to refer to the more specific IETF big meeting document needs to refer to this. It would be strange if they were not aligned on how they speak about that particular situation, but maybe a footnote at the very most. I don't think it needs to, you don't need to read both documents necessarily. But I do think I would like it if it's going to go forward. I'd prefer for it to be in a working group because I really want to try and use it to establish some principles that we can agree to, rather than just and I think it's better to do that in a working group.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, in that case, I would suggest that we have a discussion about whether this should be adopted, and depending on what the consensus is, if it's positive, we figure out what words need to change in the charter, if any.
Okay, thanks, Lars.
So, Mark, you mentioned that the document is likely to be applicable outside just our community, and while gathering requirements for how we can apply the algorithms that you're trying to build to our community, have you approached big scheduling organizations, the timeanddate.com, Doodle, anybody like that, to see if they were working on similar problems and could provide input into the discussion? It might be useful for us, or to see if they would want to adopt this into their tooling.
I think that'd be interesting. I certainly haven't talked to them, and the document does refer to some existing tooling, but I don't know that they've. This isn't really about tooling per se. It's more about coming to equitable scheduling for all the participants. There's certainly some interesting paths to explore there, but I haven't yet talked to anyone. I was thinking more in the terms of I guess accidental reuse or unintended reuse. In that the discussions we had about scheduling IAB meetings, for example, were almost exactly the discussions we had about scheduling W3C technical architecture group meetings, because it's a similar problem, and so that's why I've written in the way that I have. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to kind of have those discussions.
Thanks, Mark. Miria, you're up next.
Yeah, hi, here's Miria Kuhlewint. Yeah, thanks for writing this down. I think the thoughts in the document are a really good read. And like I think this is the right venue to have more discussion of that. I'm not sure if we need this as an RFC. And then the other bit, when I first saw your draft, I was actually expecting something a little bit different, because I think you also been very much involved in the discussion about like how many interim meetings do we need, what should be discussed in the plenary meeting or what's more appropriate for an interim meeting, design teams, like which people should be there. And you have like also different priorities about like who you want to schedule around depending on what you discuss in the meeting. So I was hoping a little bit more for this kind of advice, because that's also more IETF specific, and I think would be very valuable to have that discussion as well.
I agree it would be valuable to have that discussion. I haven't attempted to do that in this draft. I really, for now, I'm just interested in figuring out the scheduling issue. But yeah, there's lots more to dig into, I'm sure.
Thanks, Mark. Sean, you're up next.
1, 2, 3, just making sure my audio is coming through. I just want to say that I welcome this draft. The number of times that I could use this to inform other people in the world that there are time zones that are not their own, and that there's ways to pick things which are not always in your best interest, but will get the work forward, I think is the way to go. And I welcome this draft. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks.
Mallory, you're up next.
Yeah, I put myself in the queue also to say that I think this draft is really important. And I'm really glad that, Mark, you wrote it as somebody who has to endure, I think, a lot of pain and based on your time zone. So it's good that it's coming from you. I just also wondered if there's any interest in making this explicitly about synchronous meetings and making that more explicit, synchronous online meetings, or maybe there's also room to talk about the asynchronous meeting idea, which is present in a much longer draft that has other things that are out of scope, such as like how to set an agenda and so on for asynchronous meetings in a draft that's long since expired, but that I presented at one point to SHMOO. That might be also an alternative, or it could be a small section of your draft where it's just not possible to create a synchronous experience for people that is manageable, just as an idea. Thanks.
That's a great idea, and I think I definitely could add a discussion of, do you really need a synchronous meeting effectively?
Cool. Thanks, Mark. Mallory, were you done? Thank you. Daniel?
So yeah, I think it's the draft is useful to provide some recommendation and to at least explain why we pick 1 hour instead of the others. The other thing is I haven't read the draft, but I think it should be a good place to figure out what are the motivations and provide some guidelines on does an interim meeting is needed, to select the date also, and how we can organize that interim meeting. For example, at some point we can also have a compromise. We don't have necessarily everyone at every interim meetings, or sometime we can privilege one time zone over the others. This is also one reason we have two chairs. Some kind of things that might be helpful to set those time zones and those interim meetings.
Yeah, I think Daniel, rotate the pain part of the draft like does cover that, right? Like Mark, like what Daniel talked
To a
about.
degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. That's I see the queue's exhausted unless there's somebody in the room who wants to talk. Pete, like I saw you walk in. Like, did you have any thoughts about whether, like, you want to have this in gender dispatch or not? Mark expressed his interest that this stay in a working group, and Lars said like he's open to it. So, did you have any thoughts about it, or like if you can just give me a thumbs up or down, that's fine too.
This is Pete Resnick. It absolutely doesn't make a difference to me. Gen dispatch can't work on documents. So the only thing we would do for Mark is talk about it and decide where he should take it. And it seemed like if SHMOO was going to be one of the possible outputs, you folks might as well talk about it first. If you can't come to a conclusion, then bring it back to us. That's fine.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Pete.
Okay. So it sounds like next steps, maybe I should talk to the chairs.
Yeah, please, thank you. And we'll have a chat with Lars as well, like just to make sure, like, I'll look at the charter with Mallory to make sure that it's covered. If not, like, we'll send some diffs to Lars.
Did you want to do a HAMT or a tool poll or whatever it's called? So we have some data,
sure.
whether people think that, I mean, it sure sounds like it, but we only heard from like 5 people.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, let me write like some question that kind of makes sense, right?
This is your chance to use the new process. I mean, we used to make up these polls by just talking and fumbling, right? And now at least you can type and correct and nobody sees it, which is an excellent improvement.
Okay, so I did start a poll. Okay, so still hands slowly going up. Okay, so I see, I would say, unanimous interest to work on this. So we'll kick off a process to see if we can start an adoption call soon after talking to Lars. Thanks, Lars. Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. Daniel, you're up next. Let me give you slide control. You have slide control, Daniel.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about flight CO2 emissions that are associated to the IETF meetings. So the question is sort of very simple. Is I started that work asking myself, can the IETF continue with business as usual, where we have 3 in-person meetings a year? Because on the one hand, each of those meetings with in-person meetings involve thousands or more than 1,000 international flights. And on the other hand, we have science that is urging us to reduce the CO2 emissions. Recently, so the working group 2 of the IPCC 6 assessment report has been published. It's quite alarming. UN Secretary General called it a code red for humanity. The Guardian described it as the starkest warning yet of major inevitable and irreversible climate changes. So the question is, what should we do? What can we do? Should we do something? So the question I started with are, what really happens if we're considering the recommendation for the IPCC? How it's going to impact the way we operate the IETF? And then I was also wondering, what is the exact amount of CO2, or I mean, an estimation of the CO2 that either the IETF meeting represents or that is associated to one IETFer. going to 1 meeting, 2 meetings, 3 meetings, and so on. And so having meeting with airflight, so airflight was the main concern, and we can also see that what is being envisioned for aviation to remain more sustainable, and if we take those trends and if we apply those to the airflight that are involved in the IETF meetings, what would be the outcome? So that's a third thing I tried. But what we need to also consider is that, CO2, off-flight CO2 emissions is one aspect of sustainability, and there is a more general question: is how can we lead the IETF as a 21st organization, considering sustainability and switch from the 20th century to the 21st one? And this is a much broader question. I'm not trying to respond to that one, but I mean, my main focus would be that we need probably to have some expertise and some help to define a plan for that larger question. So the material is I'm using is available on this website, and I've already had a presentation on the aid workshop. I see someone in the queue.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask, Daniel. So Richard, like, did you have a clarifying question on this?
I just wanted to an observation basically. So while we are discussing here the CO2 impact of an in-person meeting, specifically, I would want to make the observation that the overall CO2 emissions, energy equivalent overall of the internet, so basically the technology that we are doing here in the IETF, has a much larger impact. And if we are really serious about this, I don't think that we should focus so much on the cents, so to speak, rather than on the dollars, meaning looking into energy efficient technologies or improving energy efficiency overall in our protocols and reducing energy consumption there, because that, quite frankly, would have orders of magnitude larger impact than discussing if 1,000 people flights should be saved or not. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Like there has been some work, Richard, like, that like at least we did in Interior for like, use of, like multicast and things like that to conserve energy. And there have been like a few point solutions. I remember there was like either a working group or a BOF or a research group like back in the day for like energy efficiency and so on. I think I'll try to find the links and ship it off, Richard. Like, and yeah, your point makes sense, right? But it's right now has not been like a coordinated effort on that. Lars, go ahead.
Yes, as a follow-up, there was a proposal for a research group called EERG, for Energy Efficient Research Group, and that was roughly 2009, I think. So if you Google for IRTF EERG, you find stuff from those meetings. I recently had a look because other people seem to be interested in revisiting that again and maybe doing some research there. And so I think Colin has it also on his radar as something that might happen in the IRTF, but it could also happen in the IETF. I guess it depends on what people want to do.
Yeah, sounds good. And thanks, Lars. That's what I remember. So I remember it was a long time ago. So I didn't remember it was 2009, but yeah, thanks.
So, I mean, if I had to respond to Richard, I would say I'm very much happy that he shares some information he has. The reason I was focusing on only the travel is that we have also less impact on how the technology is being used than that we do have on travel. And it's also that everything I found is more that the emissions are mostly related to building the device as opposed to using those. And so that was the reason I focus on something we can actually do something on. But I'm very much happy if Richard, you can share anything on the mailing list.
Not to that you get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is an effort that we shouldn't be doing. I'm just saying there is a larger fish to fry as well as also the small fish. And quite frankly, I'm really happy that you bring it up, because this is something that every individual here that is participating can do something about. Most airliners, they offer you the chance to basically offset your CO2 emissions when you buy the ticket by mitigation efforts, whatever they are offering. So there are some ways that we can do it on an individual basis already. But if it's in a more broad scope of the IETF or in the broad scope of the meeting, obviously that's good as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Go ahead, Daniel. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going ahead. So, what does the science says? Everything, mostly what I took as a base is the IPCC, which is an internationally accepted authority on climate change, and this work is widely agreed upon by leading climate scientists as well as government. And the reports are usually taken as an input for the UNFCCC. So some of the numbers are that the limit is clearly being set to 1.5 degree of warming. They even insisted that if we reach 2, we will have a dramatic impact on the ecosystem, human health, and so on. And if we want to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, emissions should be cut by roughly 50% by 2030, and we need to reach the net zero by 2050. So I am going very fast in the, I provided some very basic history to show that science is not something, has not contradicted itself at one point. They're always keeping that same message over and over for more than 30 years. And currently, I mean, everything has been confirmed. Everything they said 30 years before has been confirmed today. And currently, the target remains to be 1.5. If we don't do anything, we're moving to estimation are showing that we're heading to 3.6 degree warming. So, I mean, we are not ahead on schedule. So, the other thing is about aviation. Aviation, so it's a major contributor to global warming. It contributes around 4%, and even though they're responsible for 2.5% of the emissions, CO2 emissions, I mean their contribution is 4%, because mostly they're using non-CO2 also. And aviation is projected to cause about 0.1 degree of warming by 2050. So here is where aviation, this is the increase of aviation. And you can see that you have a big decrease due to the COVID-19. The gray box shows where we should be to address the 1.5. And I mean, you can see in the bluish color that we will soon be over the target. You can see in green where we should, what is the path we should take toward the goals for 2050. What we need to understand with aviation is that, or even CO2 emissions, is that what matters is also the accumulations of the CO2. So we can't do much about what has been already emitted, but we can do about, I mean, reducing what we will be emitting. That's one thing. So the three approach I'm going to detail is approach one. We follow just the IPCC recommendation and see how it's impact our meeting. If we meet as we used to meet before the pandemic. Approach two is estimation of CO2 emitted by the IETF meetings. Approach three is how we apply different scenario to aviation to our traveling. Approach one, it basically says cutting the emission by 50%. So if we have 3 meetings, you cut by half. it makes you have a 1 in-person meeting a year and 2 virtual meetings a year. Again, it's if we operate the same way we used to operate, which is 3 meetings a year. Net zero is everything is virtual. So approach 2 is estimation of CO2. So we developed a tool. What it does is it actually takes a real flight with different legs, and for each leg applies different models to estimate the CO2 emissions. So the models we use is we use the one referred in My Climate. We use another one on Go Climate. Go Climate provide us access to the API, and so we use that one. So for each attendee, we got the country, we take the most representative city of that country, or at least the closest city to where we can actually get a flight. It's not always easy when a lot of flights have been canceled, so we do our best to do that, but it works pretty well. And then from that flight itinerary, we compute for each leg the CO2, applying the models that have been defined. So here is what we end up with. So for each meetings from IETF 72, we compute the CO2 emitted in blue for the in-person meetings. In orange, we provide the CO2 that a remote participant would emit if he had attended to that meeting. So it's like a virtual emission. And so, well, this is what we can figure out on this. So, I mean, the interesting thing also, and this is why we represent the CO2 emission associated to remote participants, is that it can be used also as another metrics that combine the distance and the participation, as opposed to if you just count a participant as +1. So it means if you have a meeting, for example, in let's say in Paris, it makes a difference if the person is coming from Belgium than is coming from New Zealand. So considering those CO2 is a metric that could be interesting. Yes, Mirja?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, so is that normalized by number of participants, or is also where we see like the higher peaks is because we had more participants?
So that's for each participant, I compute the CO2, and then I'm doing a sum. So if you have many participants, I mean, given the distance, if you have many if you have an IETF in Paris and you have many participants in Brussels, yeah, I mean, having many participants will have a small impact, but I do consider the number of participants as well.
So it's not normalized, Miria, if I understood correctly,
No.
right? It's the higher number of participants will give a larger number. Go ahead, Martin.
Thanks. I don't have to mess with the thing. Am I reading this correctly, that the remote meetings have the same carbon impact as the regular ones?
I think Daniel was explaining that, like, it is as if the remote people, if they had been there, this would be the impact.
Ah, okay.
Which is actually a good thing, because we means I mean, we roughly have the same participation. That's how you can read it. So in terms of quantity of emissions, I found out that I do an average only considering the in-person meetings, and I took that we have 3.2 gigagram of CO2 per IETF meeting. And if you're an IETFer, I mean, participating in that's the average value, yeah. is 2.5 ton of CO2 per attendee. So that's only an average. So the big question is now, okay, that's big numbers, but what actually, that's numbers, but what do they actually represent? So the way I consider the IT, I mean, to have an to be able to compare the numbers we have and to see if that's big numbers or small numbers, I took the CO2 emissions per capita from different countries, and I tried to figure out where IETF meetings would be. So what we can see is that participating to one IETF meeting, 2 IETF, and 3 meetings bring us very close to what is actually needed by the only participation to the IETF meetings is very close to what habitant needs to live for a year in some countries. And if we dig a little bit more into the countries, we can clearly see that if you attend 3 IETF meetings, the number I found, you almost emit as much CO2 as some people living in Germany or Poland are emitting. And we have to take into account that Germany and Poland are economies that are heavily based on coal, which is a heavy emitter. For example, I think Germany is using 50% of its energy is using coal, and Poland it's 90%. If you attend 2 IETF meetings, you're using you're emitting as much as CO2 as someone living in Greece, Italy, or UK. And if you have 1 IETF meeting, it's like someone living in Mauritius or Venezuela. Well, I mean, it works what it was. It's just to give an idea of what CO2 it represents. We also have to account that as I mentioned before, I use 2 models, Go Climate and My Climate. We do have a 20% somehow difference between the 2. And if we're comparing to the results Jay is providing, we also have a 20%. So, I mean, the countries could be shift, and there are some margin for discussions as well. But it gives a good average. And overall, we can see that the question is really, do we have any way to justify that we're emitting as much as a big polluter only to participate to IETF meetings?
Yeah, Daniel, I think like few people were confused on the per capita thing on the chat. So if can I try to explain my understanding and see if I'm right, like just to clarify?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Sure.
what you're saying is if you go to 1 IETF meeting, you're emitting as much CO2 as like a person over a year in like countries like Mauritius and Venezuela. Is that the way to think about it? Okay, so you're talking about annual CO2 emissions like based on countries, and the countries are like on the labels on the x-axis, right? Like, so and you're looking at the intersect points and seeing how much like each meeting attendance costs, like the planet. Would that be a good summary? Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. George, did that make sense to you? Or I don't know if I should say Jorge or George, like if that made sense to you, just like type in the chat. Thank you. Thanks. And yeah, you can come to the mic, like if you have questions. Like we do have a bit of time today, so like, feel free to come have the discussion. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Daniel. Like, if somebody comes up, we can talk about it.
Okay, any question or? Yeah, feel free to interrupt and go to the mic. I'm not good at multiprocessing, so I won't. I'm not closely looking at the chat. Jim.
before that, before the graph that you just showed, that confused me the most. It almost looked like it was a recommendation that we should have our meetings in Ulaanbaatar or something like that, or conversely in Congo. It just confused me. So this is basically just sort of comparing
Yeah.
emissions as opposed to recommendations for where we should be citing our meetings. I mean, your earlier graph I thought was pretty interesting because, you know, we could see that the emissions had a lot to do with where the meetings were cited. And then it was followed by this, which kind of confused me.
No, so I am providing no indication on where we should set the meetings. It's just to compare those. But it's just to realize that if we're going to 3 meetings, the CO2 that we're emitting by simply going to the 3 IETF meetings correspond to the CO2 emitted by someone living in Poland or Germany. And if you go to 2 meetings, you go to it's equivalent to the CO2 emitted by someone living in countries where economy is less based on coal, so with less emissions. And I think I mentioned UK, Italy, probably France, and so those countries. Now, if you go to 1 meeting, the countries, the CO2, the data we have, I mean, it's we have to also take a pinch of salt in that, but it's Venezuela, Mauritius. It's what does it mean? Well, we need to think about it, but it still means that it's quite a lot. If the CO2 that we are requiring just to attend a meeting are the CO2 emissions that someone living in those heavy emitting countries, it's just an equal sign.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Ted,
you.
you're up next.
Excuse me. All right. Thanks, Ted Lemon. So a couple things here. One is you say that the recommendation is to go to 1 meeting a year, but in fact, cutting our meetings in half would probably mean that we'd be going to 3 meetings every 2 years, since currently we have 3 meetings every 1 year. That half would be 3 every 2, so 1.5 meetings a year. Yeah, I have to agree with the previous, I guess, Jim Fenton, that these graphs are not particularly illustrative. It's sort of like telling us how many football fields, which isn't very helpful. Yeah, or bathtubs, yeah. So, and also like you know, in your you talked about gigagrams versus tons. Again, it'd probably be good to put both numbers in the same unit, yeah. So, but the main thing that I wanted to bring up here is that I feel like this is sort of fiddling while Rome burns, and so this doesn't feel like it's all that useful, because I mean, what's probably going to happen if we actually went ahead and did anything to reduce our CO2 consumption would be that we'd feel really good about it and we'd feel satisfied, and then we wouldn't actually do anything that made a difference, because this isn't going to actually make a difference. Sorry. And so
So
I think,
what is not going to make any difference?
so the amount of CO2 that we're burning as compared to the amount of CO2 that the total world is burning is such a small number that the amount of effort that we put into saving that CO2 could probably be more effectively put elsewhere. Like, we would probably be able to reduce CO2 emissions by a lot more by spending that effort somewhere else. That's all I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean,
Reducing
so
well, I mean, no, I'm not even talking about in the IETF. I mean, like, this is just this sort of thing. Like, you know, one thing to say is that it's not clear to me that CO2 offsets are actually useful. Like, there's been some indication that some of them are scams. So I think just like, I think it's worth stepping back and actually looking at the problem systemically, rather than saying, oh yeah, we accept the frame that the problem is we're using too much CO2, and so we need to do something to stop using so much CO2 personally. That's not going to solve the problem. It's a systemic problem. So I think it's not helpful to really talk about this as if that's a real approach, because it's not.
Thanks, Ted. Lars, you're up next.
Yeah, I had a question, and I don't know if it's a question for Daniel or now for Ted. So the recommendation you have on the last slide basically is very clear. The one bullet that says, 1 meeting per year. And I guess that implies that you looked at carbon offset schemes and have decided that they're not an option for us. And if so, I would like to know why. Or
So so we're moving to the last slide. So what I'm saying is that if we assume that we have to reduce, I mean, the recommendation for IPCC is that we reduce by 50%.
right, but
so I'm just taking that and saying, yeah, how does it impact? And actually, I'm just looking at what the emission of the IETF represent, because if we found out that it was 1 milligram, then we could say, yeah, it doesn't worth even to
I
ask
understand
ourselves.
that, but so there's one way of reducing the emissions would basically to cut the travel that the organization causes in half, which is what you're proposing here, or cut it into a third, right? Another way to look at this is we could offset the costs. There's programs.
Okay,
Some of them might be, some of them might not be, might be fraud, but others might not be. And so I'm wondering if you have looked into this and decided that that is not viable. And if you have looked into it and have decided it's not viable for us, I would like to know why. And if you haven't, I think that would be good to say.
Okay, so this goes in my third point, which is basically we need to have a strategy on that. Because offset is very complex. So I haven't looked at that because I'm not an expert in that. And this is why we need some expertise from outside to do the right thing. So that's I am not considering it because I have no opinion on how to use offset. It can be good or bad, but I don't have the expertise to say what to do. And this is why my strong recommendation is that we do involve some external expertise to tell us what to do.
Thank you. That clarifies it. And so I think what you want to do is you want to show data that tries to illustrate our carbon footprint, but I would then maybe not put recommendations on the slide at all. Because if you say that you can't look at all viable options because you're not an expert, then maybe the recommendation of cutting out travel is maybe not, since it's not everything that's possible. Maybe that's not sort of, that should be presented as the only outcome that you see for us. You know what I'm saying?
Oh no, it's not the only outcome. It's if we have to reduce, this is one way.
Okay.
I mean, at least my purpose is more to raise and to say there is a problem we need to solve.
Yeah, thank you, Niall. Richard, you're up next. Okay.
So again, just to reiterate, the point with the per capita CO2 emissions is a little bit quite misleading. Part of that is in the Western lifestyle, basically what we are doing here in the IETF. So what we all are doing, the CO emissions, our CO2 footprint is including effectively the CO2 emissions that we cause by participating in travel like this, right? So I'm just saying this is not, it's not a strict scientific investigation. If you compare it like that, it becomes misleading. The other thing is, I don't think that a recommendation like having only 1 meeting per year is quite frankly the one that we need to do. If that would be like, the suggestion is that you in person participate only in that 1 meeting per year that is on your continent, say, so that it reduces your the length of travel, the CO2 emissions of that travel. That's obviously something that we have personally choice over. While I don't think that we need to carve the number of IETF meetings overall. But I think it may be a good idea to have something like a recommendation. This next meeting will cause, based on your locality and based on the locality of the conference, that amount of CO2 emissions. Do you really want to impact the global climate with that number of CO2, rather than saying IETF can only have one meeting per year?
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Martin, you're up next.
Yeah, let me try to synthesize a few things. Thanks for the analysis of the carbon footprint. I think that is interesting information and maybe helps people who look at it, people who are exposed to it will be able to think about what they're doing in a more knowledgeable way. I would like to share the pushback against making a recommendation in this space, not only because you're not able to evaluate all the alternatives, but also because you're missing half the cost benefit equation. IETF meetings in person have benefits, including benefits for the climate. Because for example, WebRTC has had benefits for the climate. And lastly, to kind of echo some of what Ted was saying, I think IETF acting alone will have no practical impact. If there's a collective effort by organizations to reduce their carbon footprint of meetings, that would be a more interesting proposition to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, so that's easy to say. We can't do anything because the others are not doing. First, it's wrong. ICANN is also looking at those numbers. So I disagree with the fact saying, oh, if the other are not doing, we're not doing, which I think it's the sense of the comment of your comment as well as TED comments. For sure, we need an effort from everyone, and that's what makes it hard to handle. But and we need also maybe to maybe clarify what are the huge benefit of yeah, we do have some there are some benefits of in-person meetings, but this all has to be balanced with the cost also.
Thank you. And Daniel, there's like two things that came up, right? Like whether we should do something or not, and like Lars's point, what we should do, right? Like, so there's different ways to address this. Like, so yeah, if you can note both of them, thank you. George, Jorge, like, thank you. I don't know how to say it, so sorry if I got it wrong.
It's okay. You can say it wherever it works for you. Thank you so much, for the detail, amount of information and analysis. And that is, really what is getting me lost. I'm getting lost in the numbers because when you do comparisons between countries, there are so many variables, including GDP, that have to do where it's convenient or not to have a meeting. I agree with Lars that this looks like something we should consider. Probably, your presentation is a good motivation to think, do we have to find an external consultant, experts, that can say, okay, what is the actual impact of every meeting, not just on the CO2 emissions, but economic impact, benefit, what you guys were talking about. I think that, a good proposal would be, to say, okay, this is something that we as eternal geeks should investigate and get, experts to work on this problem and give us a recommendation. Thank you.
Oliver? Oliver, please go ahead.
So I think that's my third bullet, which is tackle the problem with some expert in that.
Okay. Oliver, going once, twice,
I agree.
thrice. Mallory, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, it occurs to me that this is also being said in the chat since I joined the queue, which is great, but that we simply raise awareness and help people individually or companies calculate these costs, then they can make their own decision. Because, for example, like if we just generally ask folks to participate remotely more, just sort of being suggested, making it easier to do so, you would think then that the far away distant meetings are the ones you would want to avoid because the emissions would be greater. But in my personal view, it's the time zone that I then need to trade off. So because I, have a family, because I have, the nature of my situation means that it's the meetings that are far away that I would most want to travel to. It's the ones maybe middle distance that I could, do without. So that is always going to be a factor. People are going to be weighing those things. You might also imagine that some companies have individuals in different regions, and so they can make decisions and trade-offs based on who's more proximal, who can cover IETF sessions in person versus away. So we can't really imagine how folks are going to make the decisions, but we can help by raising awareness and giving them the tools to make their own calculations. And so I think that kind of guidance could actually be very useful. But whether or not to actually just host entire remote meetings as part of the decision making that comes out of that, I'm like others a little bit more dubious of that. Although having been a part of many couches before SHMOO existed, before the pandemic, I was a member just because I had experience doing remote meetings around the world in a previous job. And it was stated, like some folks actually thought, if we could get the IETF to reduce its number of in-person meetings by 1 per year, that would be an amazing goal. But, I don't know. We would obviously need more than just emissions to drive that movement. Thanks.
Thank you. Oliver, if you want to skip back ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep, thank you.
Oh, wonderful, yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you for the work you put in and the effort. I have two questions, or one question and one comment actually. Did I understood it correctly that you identified that a remote meeting has the same carbon footprint like an in-person meeting? Did I
No.
hear that?
No. So because I'm only considering a flight, if you're attending remote, you're not flying, I provide the number is 0 kilogram of CO2.
Okay.
So it's just if you were flying.
Okay, good. So the one part what maybe I have a little bit of problem with is you said that you don't make any recommendation where to meet. I think when we make these studies, they should then maybe help to identify where would we use the least, or where would we have the least carbon footprint, by always looking back one IETF to see, okay, from where did the participants come from? I don't think it's a good idea to skip meetings. Okay, maybe in-person meetings, 1 per year or so, that might be looked at. I think Ted I think it was Ted, and correct me if it wasn't, who made a good comment in regards to the economical impact. I mean, when we go somewhere, we also contribute to the local economy. So we shouldn't only look into one side in the cost what we incur, but also in the benefit what it brings. So I think there's much more behind the scene what in the first look was not really incorporated, what I believe should also be incorporated as well. And that also comes with, so if I look, for example, in the carbon footprint here at my house, since I'm remote working, of course it goes much higher up, because now we are longer in the house, we have to heat the house, we have more equipment running and so forth. And I think that also has to be looked into. If we don't travel, the airplane still flies. So these are the things where really one has to look very careful into the data to see, isn't there a false offset what we have in there that is not correct. And but again, I welcome you for the good work, and I think it's worthwhile looking further into that.
Thank you. Thanks, Oliver. Ted, you're up next.
Hi, Ted Lemon. Just one thing before I actually say what I want to say is I tend to have a cognitive bias towards criticizing, and I apologize if my previous comment was basically just 100% criticism. I do appreciate you doing this work. You made a couple of points there that I think make sense. One is, can the IETF actually do something to reduce the number of in-person meetings that people do all around? The existence proof is the IETF has done that, because if you look at what happened during the pandemic, most of our meetings were on Zoom or Meet Echo or whatever. That's something that we all as a society collectively learned how to do, that was possible because of what the IETF had done, and also because of what organizations like Zoom had done to produce that software. So there are wins like that we could probably enable that would far outweigh any kind of carbon reduction that we get from not coming to meetings. I say that as someone who really like I was one of the people that was having that conversation with Mallory about, well, can we just have fewer meetings because of all this carbon? But having missed 6 in-person meetings at this point, I think, and then coming to one, man, it is really useful to come to these meetings. We get a lot of stuff done. It's hard to really quantify the value of that, and so I just don't feel like we know enough to make a clear statement that, oh, if we had fewer in-person meetings, that would actually save carbon. It might do quite the opposite. If we make progress on controlling DDoS attacks, if we reduce the number of what do they call it? If we increase the ratio of good put to bad put, the amount of energy that we could save doing that would be huge. If we can figure out a way to get the Bitcoin fiends to stop burning coal to make coins, we could easily save several orders of magnitude more carbon just by succeeding at that task. Not saying we can, but maybe we could find a task like that. So many orders of magnitude more carbon by succeeding at that task than by addressing this particular problem. This problem is relatively easy to address, which makes it attractive. But the point I was getting at is that it might be worth actually putting the effort into figuring out strategically what we could do as an organization that would actually make really major impacts. Like, our best case scenario, if the IETF is all 4% of the airline stuff, is that we reduce global warming by 0.1 degrees C if we stopped coming to these meetings. That's a very small number. We need to reduce it by a lot more than that. And I think that the people that come to the IETF have opportunities where they can actually do that kind of thing. So that's what I'm getting at when I say let's back off to 20,000 feet, so to speak, and think big. What could we really do here that would really make a difference, as opposed to what's obvious and easy but might not make that big a difference?
Well, it's one thing that we don't have clear plan. I'm happy to have a better impact, but so far I haven't heard a clear plan. So it's always easier to say we can do better, but we do nothing. And I think that's something we should avoid.
One, two, three, four. Okay. Hey, hi, Daniel. I just want to basically say the same thing that Ted said, probably quicker. Thanks for doing this work. Thanks for thinking about it. But everything else he said, I completely agree with. And I think you're right. We should think about it and try to figure out what the plan is. I think 2 and 3 are great. 1, I'm not sure falls from the analysis you did, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. I think the way that we should start this is to first ask, are 3 meetings the right number for IETF? I would much rather have one big meeting with everybody there a year rather than 3 with sparse attendance in person. And so one of the things I think that we need to look at going forward is what the attendance is on site. And if it doesn't pick up substantially, we've got to revisit. I think at that point, going to a 1 a year would become a pretty big argument. Having said that, if we did that, it would not save any CO2, because what would then happen is that the number of interim meetings would likely go up, and people would then be flying to their interim meetings. Far fewer days spent abroad at IETF meetings, but just as many plane flights. Coming to the offsets question, one of the amazing facts is that the amount of kerosene that is used for lighting is equal to the amount of kerosene that is used in the entire global aviation industry. And that's a really easy offset to make, because an LED light powered by a solar panel costs less than a gas lamp to provide and doesn't require the kerosene that costs the users a huge amount of money. Most of the kerosene lanterns are used in sub-Saharan Africa. They're smelly, they're dirty, they're a health hazard. And so maybe if we got into that form of carbon offset, you know, as an IETF wide, made that easy, maybe that would be some way to improve the carbon offsets system. And finally, on the cryptocurrency system, at this point, I would absolutely sincerely like to see switchblade loitering munitions used to take out Bitcoin mining operations. I want to destroy them with drones, EMP strikes, the lot. I am fed up of them. They're a bunch of fascists, and I do not want to see them survive. They're awful.
Thanks, Carl. Nick, go. You're the last one to go. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this presentation, and this is a useful discussion, even if sometimes I find the reactions frustrating. I think it's a really useful presentation because I think you're getting at some good data on what sorts of emissions are coming from flights, and that can help us like have some baselines and comparisons, and that will make it easier for us to actually measure the impacts of these different conclusions. And maybe we would have different alternatives for how we do IETF meetings, whether it's the number of meetings or who travels to which meetings or different things like that. But I think having those numbers will be really useful. I do think there's some useful feedback we're hearing about how to present that information most effectively. And if we wanted to have like a sort of ongoing dashboard or have a document or have a report or something, maybe we could give you some useful feedback on the best ways to present that. I've certainly found some of the reactions frustrating this time and every other time that we've discussed this, that the emissions are always someone else's fault, not us, or we do such good things that our emissions are actually saving long-term emissions. I certainly hear that from every group that discusses this topic, not just IETF. I think everyone thinks that their travel really is important. But it might also just be useful that like, hey, we can start to write down some of those discussions since we've had them so many times, and consider those arguments, and maybe there's a useful like work item there too. I know those are difficult discussions, and I know we're having them repeatedly, and maybe it's worth trying to start writing them down, and that might get us to better conclusions in the long run. So thank you for doing this, and I hope we can turn it into some sort of more systematic approach, or maybe it'll be useful data for what Jay is going to talk to us about as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Again, thanks for your work on this. Jay, if you're out there.
I think you're supposed to control the slides on that. I don't know if that's possible. No, okay. I think this is just a monitor. It's showing.
Slides, or do you want control?
Oh, Suresh is supposed to give you control.
Yeah, I'm just passing it on. Yeah, done.
Thanks.
Stand here.
Okay. Right. So I'm going to talk, assuming this works again, about what we're doing about carbon emissions within the LLC and what we've been thinking about. So we started doing some work back in 2020 about this and put it on hold when everything moved towards online meetings. And we recently picked it up again. I discussed this with Daniel a couple of years ago. So I'm going to separate this out into two elements. One is measuring carbon emissions, and the second one is about offsetting carbon emissions. All right, thank you. I'm working on the basis that we're always going to be emitting carbon, and at least until we are net zero. And so carbon offset remains a potential strategy to use, even if the number of meetings is reduced, and that anything to do with the number of meetings is outside of scope for me to be particularly interested in. So the work to date so far is that we've used consultants to calculate emissions for the last 6 on-site meetings. It's a simple methodology, assumes travel from the capital city of each country and economy flights. We use event venue emissions based on the area of event space that we rent out, and the hotel emissions on the number of estimated room nights that we have for attendees. We used international standards. GHG is the greenhouse gas protocol. It's the standards body for carbon emissions, and so this is from their emission factors for cross-sector tools, and the assumptions about energy use that then feed into those for venues and hotels are based on the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey data. So these are the figures that we have in metric tons of CO2 emitted for the previous 6 meetings in terms of total carbon emissions. Or equivalent, carbon equivalent. So as you can see, this is air travel is basically the big one here. And Singapore is 6,000, is much larger than, say, Montreal because of the geographical nature of the people that we have coming. What I'd like to do on carbon calculations in future is have correct city rather than just assume the capital city. Take into account the mode and class of transport, because business class is much higher emissions than economy, and take into account the route. And by mode, I mean whether people are traveling by train or traveling by air as well. Now, of course, that relies on people giving us that data, but if we can get that data, then we can actually get something quite clear. And I'd also like to look at calculations around the non-meeting operations and to use the calculation standards as they develop, because the calculation standards are changing all of the time. There's a concept, for example, in air travel called, I think, pushed carbon, which is one of the reasons that people think that air travel is actually worse for carbon emissions than we currently think it is. And so people are looking to develop standards around that. And this talk has been brought forward. I wasn't planning to do this yet, and I was planning to have a discussion about this, but the questions that I would like to ask the community, which you can answer now or I'll try to do it at some point, are, look, I don't think, well, are there any objections to the LLC just getting on with the measurement? All right, if there is, let me know. And what role is there for the community in this? And when I wrote this, I didn't really know about Daniel's work, though Daniel and I have spoken about this for some time. So that's number one, is about measuring our emissions. So the second part is about offsetting. And I haven't done anything on this so far, except to identify consultants who can help us with this. As I think George said earlier, a couple of people said, this is quite a complicated area. And so I think it would be useful for us just to have consultants who can provide educational material, who can contribute to community discussions such as this, and who can research the market if we chose to go ahead with offsetting, because it is quite complex. So we've some people who can help us do that. And the questions I need to ask are, what kind of community consensus is needed to offset? Now, in case it's not clear, I want to avoid any discussion on whether or not climate change is real. I think we all want to avoid that. Let's just assume it is, okay? So this isn't about, do we need to do anything about it? It's about whether offsetting is a way to do something about it. So it's not clear to me what kind of community consensus is needed. None. Whether the LLC can simply just pay an offsetting fee after each meeting that we think offsets our estimation of carbon emissions. And obviously determining what kind of scheme is some effort behind that. Whether we need consensus to do that, whether needs some policy guiding how we offset, because as Philip said, and was quite right, kerosene lamps are one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions. And it seems a bit strange, but investing in throwing away kerosene lamps and buying LED lights for people really can change things. But it's not the same way, not the way that many people see this, which they think is that good offsetting is like buying some rainforest, for example, or replanting some rainforest, that kind of stuff. And then the final one is, do we need some kind of policy or consensus on the chosen methods and schemes, what level we need to go to? So, and I'm not clear about that. So my plan had been simply to write this up a little bit more detailed than this, and then actually go to the admin discuss list and ask people, right, what do we do about this and how do we take this forward, and then get some answers which may have meant coming back here or going to Gen Dispatch or something like that. So that's where I am so far. Any questions at all?
Ted, go ahead.
No, I'm jumping the queue.
So one thing to maybe add to the bottom set of bullets would be, what percentage of offset do you want? So I mean, the natural assumption is, well, we should just do 100%, right? Because that mitigates the damage. Maybe more than that would be better. Maybe less than that would be better. I don't think less than that would be better. But if you really care about this problem, then it kind of makes sense to ask that question. Like could the IETF meeting actually be a net benefit as opposed to just break even? And the other thing is, the one thing that I would want you to be really careful about, and I don't know whether, I don't actually know the answer to those questions. Like, should I have a say in this, or am I just some jerk talking at the mic? Probably the latter. But I'd really like whoever does this work to make absolutely sure that the carbon offsets are actually doing something. So for example, you use the example of buying rainforest, and I think that a lot of that is actually like highly questionable. And so, but also like, relief efforts are often sort of very paternalistic and don't actually address the needs of people. And so they wind up, you wind up with like LED lights that the battery runs out, they can't figure out how to get it working again, and it winds up just going in a trash heap, and now you've just created some trash and not actually offset the carbon. So I'd really like it if that does happen, that it be very carefully done, and that we know for sure, and that we'd be able to have reports on whether this is a success, and metrics and change if it turns out that the thing we chose actually sucked.
There are schemes for accrediting carbon offset stuff. And I would like us to be able to bring in these consultants to have conversations with us and explain that accreditation, explain those schemes, and us to have a broader conversation to avoid exactly what you're describing there.
Yeah. My worry with the accreditation guys is that they'd better present some pretty detailed data that we can validate ourselves, as opposed to us just believing them, because, you know, it's a great business to be in.
Okay, thanks.
Hi,
Okay, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, Martin Duke, Google. Is there a precedent for the LLC embarking on sort of corporate social responsibility spending?
No.
No. Okay. So this is virgin territory.
Hey, I just want to say that's not entirely. This is Sean Turner. I'm sorry to jump in there. That's not entirely true. We do have some ESG, equitable, ethical investing that's part of our portfolio already with the money that we have. So it's not entirely to say no.
And we also have plans for childcare at on-site meetings and things as well. So
okay, so that didn't go through a formal consensus process.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, well then, I mean, I would say that you're probably. I mean, it's always great to get community input, but I personally don't think we need to go through the whole formal thing. So my other comment is kind of wishy-washy, because I don't know what to think about exactly, but the IETF obviously is a relatively financially constrained nonprofit, and a lot of the attendees are extremely profitable corporations who could certainly choose to offset their carbon emissions of their employees coming to IETF, and certainly it would be sort of a net win if we could leverage that instead of IETF funds in terms of sort of the economic justice of the whole thing. I don't know how to do that, so I'm not going to say we should do that as opposed to what you're saying. But if there's some way to partner with some of these sponsors, that strikes me as a particularly efficient way to do so.
So thank you. I thought about that, and it's quite complicated to do, and it's probably more beneficial if simply err on the side of double counting and double offset.
Yep.
And then achieves Ted's point of offsetting beyond 100%.
That sounds reasonable. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nick?
Thank you for doing this. And I know that we're talking pretty quickly about the offsetting side, but I actually think the measuring side was the more useful conclusion. I appreciate that you've done this already with travel versus other emissions of the meetings, and as I think we've heard from other people, you want to focus on the things that are most important, and it's certainly as I would expect it, but I appreciate that you have data for it, that the travel to meetings is thousands of times more impactful than the hotel emissions, et cetera. Great, good to know. I think it would be really useful to continue that measurement, and that I would focus more on the measurement than the offsetting, both because I think we need to reduce emissions, not just offset them for many of the challenges of effective offsets that people have discussed. And because the situation is now very urgent, as I think we've heard from the IPCC, so we need to do some reductions. So I would certainly encourage IETF to continue with the measurement and maybe documenting that and sharing that with the full community, not just SHMOO, would be very useful. It'll create some of that same pushback or reaction, but I think the data will be very useful, and I hope you'll do it without needing our consensus for you to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, I agree with you about the measurement. I have to admit, I thought I had actually blogged those measurements when we had them done in 2020. I found out last week I hadn't, so sorry for sitting on those for that long, but yeah.
Thanks, Nick. So yeah, I kind of like in the same boat as like Nick, and like a little bit on the same as like Martin before as well. So like, yeah, I think the measurement is really good. And I think like as it came up from like Daniel's presentation, Also look at, like, how much, like, how do you quantify something for the remote participants too, right? Like, so we can measure how that works. And for the action part on the offsetting, right? Like, I kind of like took like Ted's point into mind. And I think it'll be good to have a community consultation process. Like, I don't know about whether consensus is needed or not, but at least, like, put up, like, what you're thinking of and so on, and try to get input from the community on what they think, right? Like, see if somebody has experiences from some of that before. So the consultation would be really useful, I think, no matter what you do otherwise. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Lars, I'm speaking for a moment as one of the directors on the board of the LLC, right? So I think technically, it's in the scope of the LLC board to manage the carbon cost of the organization already. I still think we probably prefer to have some explicit sort of indication from the community that they would encourage us to do so, and maybe actively to manage that cost. So I think that I would like to see. I think we're probably prepared to, at the plenary or in some other form, report on something that we're doing when it's sort of something specific is there to report. But I would caution that we don't sort of micromanage what the LLC board should investigate. But you all have an email address. You can send us suggestions, but I don't think we should like design this by committee, and rather sort of basically us, again, the community, tell the LLC board we want you to actively do something here. Let us know what you're doing, and then, make good choices, as Spencer would say. Thank you.
Pete Resnick, yeah, I said in the chat room, but I thought I would just say it so that others hear it. The LLC was designed so that the community didn't have to come to consensus for every business decision, whether it's where our meetings are held or what tooling we're going to have and all this stuff. That's why we have the LLC as a separate entity. And so doing something for carbon emissions, it's got to be reviewable by the community. You've got to be transparent about it, and we can give you feedback and say, no, please don't do that anymore, or yes, do more of that. But getting consensus ahead of time is not required.
Thanks.
Hi, Brian Trammell, Google. +1 to what Pete said. However, as Lars was speaking about, yeah, it probably does make sense to have some venue for the community to provide input on this. Is this working group not that venue? I mean, like, this would be the place for people who are interested in the machinery of how we meet. Yeah. And this looks like it very much is related to that.
I agree. But I also think that once the LLC would start to actively do something, it could take the form of a plenary presentation, for example, in addition to having maybe some more nitty-gritty reporting here if this community desires that, right?
Yeah, but I would think that the nitty-gritty reporting I would want to show up here because we already have the venue.
Well,
so
I would like to have input from community people when we have, some kind of workshops or something with these consultants. There's a lot of things to think about. People bring lots of different points of view and think quite hard about stuff. And I think together we can probably end up with something better than if it was just left to me to do.
So Lars, I know you don't want to micromanage the LLC, but I got to put in one vote for the fire up the IETF Air Force and bomb the Bitcoin guys, like PHP was suggesting. No, seriously, so like actually thinking about this a little more, in terms of like who you need to get permission from, it strikes me that it depends on what the incidence. This is going to cost money. The question is where the incidence that falls on. If like donors absorb this, then obviously this is a donor thing. Whereas if this is just like directly tacked on to the price of the meeting fee, then that's a community issue, right?
Yeah, no, it's absorbed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, yeah, I mean, in that case, like I don't see why. Well, I don't know that community objections really have a ton of standing. I mean, like in principle, you could use the money instead to like lower meeting fees or something, but if it's not going to actually affect the status quo of what people are experiencing at meetings,
I mean,
thank you.
Yeah,
one argument to make is that the LLC board is supposed to steward the organization, right? And part of that is like maybe making sure that there's a planet to have meetings on in the future. And so you can argue that carbon offsetting or some way to manage the carbon footprint is therefore inherently something that we're chartered to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable argument. And I guess my point is that as a potentially completely indifferent attendee at IETF, like nothing is changing behind the curtain. There's some offsetting going on. Well, great. like if you're saying I'm going to jack up your attendance fee by $250, then at least I have something to be mad about.
No, I mean,
right?
I don't know if we're prepared to say anything about financials. I think there were some initial numbers that were basically not at a level where, you know.
I can take a guess. I mean,
take a guess.
Yeah, I think we're looking at about $30,000 offset cost per meeting, which is a tiny fraction of the cost.
Oh,
of
well
the
then.
meeting.
Well, then why are we talking about? Let's just do it.
Yeah.
No, okay, very well. Yeah, like I said, I mean, ultimately the actual impact on the organization, whether it be donors or, ultimately we're stewards of the donors' money. And so if I imagine you've already consulted them, or will do soon anyway. Yeah, but sorry, I'm saying it again, but lastly, yeah. So like if there's no impact on attendees, then this seems like a pretty minor thing.
Great, thank you.
No more cookies. No.
I think Mallory, you're up next. Don't get between people on the cookies. I think this is going to backfire.
Yeah, I'm actually coming to the queue with chair hat on. I think that based on the charter, this is work that's in scope. And I've previously to a comment I made with Daniel's slides, guidance for individuals or companies to make decisions about whether or not to participate remotely or in person, this could be very useful. So while everyone is, including myself, encouraging you to keep doing this work and make decisions within the mandate of the LLC without having to consult, I do hope that you stay in touch and bring some of this work back to SHMOO and to think about what kind of guidance that might look like. So thanks a lot, Jay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Nick, did you have something else to say, or was your hand up from the previous time?
No, I had something else. I was curious whether I think we heard a few times that, oh, maybe this should be part of a larger discussion, either because we should be looking at other benefits or other emissions impacts, or we should be working with other organizations so that we have some coordinated response. I think I heard that sort of feedback that people wanted to only decrease our emissions if we were doing it in a coordinated way with others. And so I was curious if that conversation needs to happen somewhere else, or if that should be IETF-wide or working with other organizations outside IETF, and how we what our next step should be for that.
So I don't know that we've engaged in active discussions yet with other organizations, but we are regularly talking to like ISOC and ICANN and the RARs and organizations like that, the W3C, and we can certainly put it on the agenda for one of the sort of joint discussions to see if they're doing anything yet, inform them maybe of what we're planning to do and see if there's any synergies. You know, they might have good ideas that we didn't have yet.
I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Lars, do you know, like, by any chance, if this open stand thing we started, like, about a decade ago, is it still in place? Like, is there something we talk to those bodies?
There's a web page, but it's been pretty quiet. I think we're much more frequently talking to the organizations I mentioned earlier, that sort of they're colloquially called the I-STAR organizations.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks. So I don't see anybody else in the queue. Jay, thank you very much for your presentation. And unless somebody has something in the next minute, like, or 30 seconds, we are good to go. So going once.
One thing I can tell you is that the charter approval is on the agenda for the next ISG telechat. So you should be rechartered soon.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Lars. Is there an IESG meeting tomorrow? No, I'm just kidding. Thanks. So thank you very much all for coming, and I wish I could have been there. Thank you very much, and thanks for everybody who made the effort to be there, and thanks for everybody for up in like some inopportune time somewhere, like especially like Mark's like always like in the wrong side of things, as people said. So thank you very much for like staying up in your time zone as well. So see you all at the next meeting.
So, no, I think the interesting question is if there was no downside, obviously you do even very, very constantly. Yeah, and that's going to be the tricky thing is, yeah, we want to do this, because why not? But how big is the downside? I think to a certain extent, we want to figure out, you know, let's say.
Maybe we can have both. Expect that we have a meeting and we can have to throw away the